We're watching the numbers, and as everyone logs on, we'll get started in just a few minutes. We'll just give it a minute or two and then get started. That looks like things are leveling off, so let's begin. Welcome to all. My name is Dave McCreary. I'm Director of Major Gifts at Feinberg School of Medicine. We're very pleased to have you join us this afternoon. This will be a discussion among the leaders of Feinberg's new and exciting Institute for Augmented Intelligence in Medicine. During the event, feel free to submit questions through the Q&A button. We will do our best to respond as time allows. Our discussion will be led by Dr. Abel Coe. He's the director of the Institute, which we refer to as I-AM, as we call it. Dr. Coe, a fabulous leader at Feinberg for the past 15 years, also is the founding director of the Center for Health Information Partnerships in Feinberg's Institute for Public Health and Medicine. Dr. Coe is a professor of medicine specializing in general internal medicine and geriatrics, as well as professor of preventive medicine specializing in health and biomedical informatics. I will come back on at the end of the conclusion of the discussion to add some follow-up information for everybody. But right now, Abel, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, David. So I really want to express my gratitude to David and the team at the Feinberg School of Medicine for making this event possible. I'm really excited today to be able to talk to you. Thank you for the kind introduction. So by way of sort of timeline, I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to the Institute and to our panelists who have joined us today, taking time out of their busy schedules. We're going to have about 30 minutes of time to talk about augmented intelligence in medicine. And then we're going to leave the last 20 minutes for you, the audience, to pose questions or comments. Some of you did send comments or questions ahead of time. And so where possible, I'm going to try to weave that into the discussion today. My goal isn't to be comprehensive. I think there's not enough time for that, but rather just to introduce you to this topic in our institute and to engage you, the audience, in thinking about how we're going to leverage these novel data and analytics methods to help improve the health and healthcare. So to set the stage, I thought it might be useful for us to think about what are some of the major medical advances in history. And it's pretty clear if you think about this past year. Vaccines are one of them. Clearly, that's what's enabling us all to sort of reopen society. Antibiotics is another example, and that's prior to even this past pandemic. Infectious diseases from bacterial infections were one of the leading causes of death and disability worldwide. In both those examples of medical advances, they often depended on a certain amount of chance. It was typically an inspired individual who made a single astute observation and put one and one together around a single data point or observation. For example, with vaccines, it was Edward Jenner who saw that milkmaids who had been infected with cowpox wouldn't get smallpox. That's how we got the name vaccine, from the Latin word vacca for cow. Similarly with antibiotics, you have Alexander Fleming, and he's sort of in his lab, and he notices one day that there's a mold growing inside one of his petri dishes, and that's how he discovered penicillin. Again, a chance sort of event and a very astute observation. Well, today, data is being generated and gathered in every aspect of our lives. And so that data generation is creating like myriad opportunities now for us then to combine those across different types of settings, but also then to analyze them with advanced methods. Some of the things that you'll hear about today, things like artificial intelligence, machine learning. And so we believe that that is the next enabling leap forward in medicine. It's already affecting the rest of your life. You can think about image recognition. Your phone can recognize your face to open up your iPhone. Your devices at home can recognize your voice when you order things. When you order things, the routing of all those packages is also being facilitated by these advanced methods. Even the advertisements you see, it's all being managed by these machine learning methods. So in medicine, we're excited about the possibility of how those same methods might be used to help us transform how we diagnose and precisely treat diseases. And so I'm going to just put a couple slides just to introduce you to the Institute. And so I think, Catherine, you may have the slides. Thank you. So the Institute was launched just recently, as Dave pointed out, and it was established really, next slide, focused on taking all of these different methods and bridging them with human expertise to advance medical science and improve human health. Next slide. We're guided by a couple simple principles, and you'll see that many of these are modeled off of the existing Hippocratic Oath. And so there are things like valuing privacy. We know we've heard about privacy. That's a big concern when it comes to data. Acting with humility, ethics. And that's really important for the Institute that we get ethics embedded from the very start. And so you'll hear from Kelly today about some of those, some of the work that she's doing. We're not in the market of breaking things. If you break things in healthcare, bad things can happen. And so we're going to go ahead and move very deliberately to ensure that we're actually respecting the tools that exist today, but augmenting them, making them better. And that word augmentation was very deliberate. When we started this, the option was artificial intelligence. We made a deliberate decision early to call it augmented because we wanted to make sure that the patient and the providers were central to this technology, that ultimately at the end of the day, the person making the decision about your care is the person that you trust, And so we're also guided by, again, this is a medical school, beneficence. We're going to do what's right. So at the end of the day, we're going to make sure that whatever the tool is, we're not focused on the technology. At the end of the day, we're focused on the people and doing right by the people. So next slide. There's lots of people involved with the Institute, and we're really, really fortunate at the Institute. We were able to bring together many, many people. And so you've got folks like Dr. Lowe and Ed Amati and Dr. Michelson you'll hear about from today, Dr. Webby. Each of them are on their own doing amazing things. And you might have read some of their work in newspapers, for example. They're already doing amazing work. And we're very fortunate that they're here to help us. And next slide. We have 5 inaugural centers. Dr. Cooper is focused on a lot of the imaging work that we know that there's been really already pretty exciting advances with the applications of AI, machine learning, and other domains. We're seeing that here in medicine. One focused on education. Again, we're a medical school. We want to train the next generation of leaders. Drs. Leibovitz and Green are leading us there. Dr. Starnes, we're doing work in biomedical informatics and data science. It brings a storied track record to that center. Dr. Feng Yu working on molecular analysis methods. And then Sanjeev Shah, we'll hear about today, who's really precisely trying to define diseases and then tailor treatments to those newly defined diseases. Next slide. So I'm really pleased now to introduce today's discussants, and then we'll go right into questions. So first discussant today, and again, this will just be a panel discussion, Dr. Lee Cooper. He's Associate Professor of Pathology, and he directs the Center for Computational Imaging and Signal Analytics and Methods. So really focused on some of the imaging and precise diagnostics that is the hallmark of pathology today. Dr. Kelly Michelson, she's clinically an expert in treating the very sickest children as a pediatric intensive care specialist, but she's also the Julia and David Eline Professor of Bioethics and Medical Humanities, and also directs the Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities. And she's somebody who we thought at the very start, let's make sure that we we put that front and center for any new project that comes along. And then Dr. Sanjeev Shah is Neil Stone Professor of Medicine, a practicing cardiologist, and he directs the Center for Deep Phenotyping and Precision Therapeutics. So first of all, please join me in thanking and welcoming our discussants today who are really busy. I think Kelly's even on vacation right now and made time for us today. And then we're going to go ahead and just start right in with a couple of questions. So our discussants are sort of getting their cameras back on. So I was just going to lead off with something I think that would maybe help the audience get to know you a little bit. And so each of you are experts in your own right. You come from very different areas of expertise. But today we're talking about augmented intelligence and advanced data analytics. And so I was hoping you might take some time, and if you could share a little bit about how you ended up working in the space of AI and ML. And just for timing, maybe we'll go alphabetical order. So Dr. Cooper, Dr. Michelson, and Dr. Shah. So Lee, do you want to go ahead and lead off?
Sure, thank you, Abel. So my PhD studies focused on computer vision, which is a type of AI that deals with images. And so I was already in AI. My story is more about how I found my way into medical applications and pathology. And so I took a biology elective in graduate school and realized that biology is like so much more complex than any of the physics that I learned about as an engineer, and just found that really fascinating. And later, I learned about pathologists and how, they develop these amazing pattern recognition skills and how their decisions, often determine the treatment that patients receive, even though they're working in the background, not interacting with the patients. And so it seemed like this is an area where AI could have a real significant impact on medicine by helping the pathologists to be more consistent when they're doing diagnosis, and also to develop better systems for classifying complex diseases like cancer.
That's great. Thank you, Lee. If you don't mind, I'll use your first name, if that's okay. So Dr. Michelson or Kelly, you want to tell us a little bit about your backstory?
Yeah, feel free to call me Kelly. As Abel mentioned, I work in the pediatric intensive care unit for children. And I really ended up in that space because as a pediatric resident, I was really taken by some of the conversations I was privileged to be a part of as a resident in communicating with parents as their children were sick and even dying, and thinking about how do families make decisions with healthcare providers in that incredibly challenging space where no parent should ever find themselves. And I became actually really interested in that communication. How do we talk with families? So really the relationship that a doctor has with their patient, that a clinician team has with the families that they care for. And in learning more about that, I became very interested in bioethics. As you can imagine, when you're starting to think about questions about how do you care for someone who's dying, what do you do, what kinds of things do you not do, ethical questions rise to the top. And so I immersed myself in bioethics, and it's really through ethics that I got into AI. And as we've seen technology really come into every space virtually and not virtually exactly in medicine. And I've been able to think about ethics and how do those things overlap and how can we maintain that doctor-patient relationship, that very special, important characteristic that drew me in to begin with when all this technology is happening. So those were some of the things that kind of brought me to AI.
And it makes a ton of sense. I mean, that is really sort of like the focal point in the medical trajectory, isn't it? Like when patients are at their sickest. And so I think those life and death issues, I mean, the ethics has got to be sort of front and center. So really makes a ton of sense. Sanjeev, you're no stranger to really sick patients as well. I mean, you're in cardiology. How did you end up in this space?
Yeah, well, thanks, Abel, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. I kind of stumbled into AI and machine learning backwards, I think, trying to solve a problem or a couple of problems with my patients who have congestive heart failure. So like you said, I'm a cardiologist, And I take care of patients with congestive heart failure. So the heart's not able to meet the demands of the body and patients feel very short of breath. They can't exercise like they used to. And probably the easiest way for me to describe it is by relating a story of one of my patients, one of my favorite patients. So he was in his 70s and he came to me. He was a retired high school PE teacher, actually, and very active his whole life. But now he was really debilitated. He could barely do anything. And he had a form of congestive heart failure that over 3 million people in the United States have, where the heart muscle squeezes normally, but it's stiff. And there's not a lot of treatments for that. And so he came to see me after seeing a number of different doctors. And I took a look at his ultrasound of his heart in the office that day. It popped up right away. I knew what he had. He had a disease called cardiac amyloidosis, which is a rare disease. And it's when proteins abnormally deposit into the heart muscle and make it stiff. And so blood can't get in and it can't get out. And so as I'm looking at this echocardiogram, this is, almost 15 years ago, I'm thinking, I am able to see this one picture on an ultrasound and make the diagnosis, but this gets missed all the time. I mean, this gentleman was going around for years and not diagnosed. And so could a computer automate and make that diagnosis? The other thing is, for congestive heart failure, it's a really heterogeneous syndrome. And so we need better ways of classifying it. So we've been using these machine learning techniques to basically sift through thousands of data elements to find patterns in the data that we humans can't see, and might be able to identify other diseases like this cardiac amyloidosis that are subtypes of more broad diseases like heart failure that we can actually treat. And this cardiac amyloidosis we can treat today. So, and new treatments are coming up. So we can follow up these machine learning pattern recognition, find these subtypes of disease, and then find treatments for them. That's sort of the precision therapeutics part of it. And this particular patient, he loved pickleball. I'd never even heard of what pickleball was. And he educated me and he said, I go to Florida every year for the winter, and I play pickleball and tennis. And I said, hey, where in Florida do you go? And he said, Fort Myers. And I said, that's crazy. That's where my in-laws live. And I go there every winter as well with my family. Turns out they live in the same subdivision. And we treated him. I went there. I played tennis with him in person, and he beat me really bad. And it was at that point he was 8 years old, and that speaks more to my tennis ability maybe than. But it was really gratifying to be able to diagnose him and treat him. Although it was still too late. It was still and it was still later than it could have been. And an automated AI-powered diagnosis could have made that earlier. And he was in one of our clinical trials, which resulted in a treatment that now extends the life of patients with this cardiac amyloidosis. But unfortunately, he died, even as healthy as he was, because it's a progressive disease. So to me, that drives home the point. Two things that I'm trying to solve. One is we need to have automated tools to help clinicians understand when their patient might have a disease that they're missing. And the second thing is to better classify these heterogeneous broad diseases so we can actually come up with therapies for them.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, as we all went through training, we oftentimes were given sort of a list of here are the possible diseases out there and diagnoses. What I'm hearing you saying, Sanjeev, is that there are diagnoses that don't even yet exist in the lexicon. Like it sounds like there's new ways of defining diseases themselves, not just the treatments. And so I don't know, maybe you and Dr. Lee could talk a little bit about some of your work in trying to come up with new ways of defining diseases.
You want to go first, Sanjeev? Or?
Sure, you go ahead.
Okay. That's definitely true in pathology as well. The classifications are ever evolving and becoming finer and finer grained. I think really the promise of AI is like providing pathologists with quantitative measurements that they can use to really objectively define these entities. And I think when you stop taking it away from kind of visual categorical and moving more towards these precise numerical measurements, you do see that there are much like finer grained distinctions that correlate with clinical outcomes in some cases.
Yeah, I'll just give two examples. So one is that so we did this pattern recognition thing in this form of heart failure, and what comes up time and time again are sort of younger, morbidly obese patients with heart failure who we now know, we just kind of followed up the biology of this type of patient, and based on some of their clinical characteristics, determined that they almost have an endocrine problem. They have a deficiency in a hormone called BNP. And so just kind of like your thyroid, you can be hyperthyroid or overactive thyroid or hypothyroid or low thyroid. There's a hormone that the heart produces called BNP that we use every day to diagnose heart failure that some people just don't make. And what's interesting is this BNP hormone, if you don't have enough of it, you actually are more predisposed to having metabolically unhealthy fat inside, the bad fat inside our bodies, covering our organs. You can't, relax your blood vessels, so you get high blood pressure. You can't get rid of fluid, so you retain fluid. I mean, that's all those things cause the heart failure. And so by looking at patterns that the machine identified, we were able to follow up on that and say, hey, this is a new syndrome that might need a totally different treatment than what we've been trying to do with patients with heart failure. The other really interesting thing is, speaking of what Lee was talking about, computer vision and images and imaging. So we've been really trying to use deep machine learning to recognize patterns or diagnose new diseases on echocardiography or ultrasound of the heart. And you probably know that Google, if you put in some photos or on your phone, on your smartphone, you can put in like cat or dog or one of your kids, and it'll show up. It's basically identifying those pictures, those photos through deep learning. But those are static photos. So we thought, can we do that with videos? And sure enough, you can. And so that's how we're diagnosing this cardiac amyloidosis disease in an automated fashion. But what's really fascinating above and beyond that is, I'll give you an example of a study where they said, okay, here are 1,000 echocardiograms or ultrasounds of the heart. And I'm going to tell the computer what the ages are of all these patients with these echocardiograms. And now I'm going to give it a whole new, 10,000 new ultrasounds or videos of the heart. And I wanted to predict the age. And sure enough, the computer was able to do it with this deep learning algorithm. So you might ask, well, why do I need a computer to tell me the age of the patient when I can just talk to the patient and they can tell me their age? And that's true. But what was really fascinating about this is, even though people think of deep learning as a black box, we now have ways of telling where the computer is focusing, where the machine is focusing when it makes that determination of age. So when they did that, we did that on this ultrasound image, you can actually see where the computer is focusing on for age. And what you see is what happens to the heart with aging, where in the heart aging occurs. And in a way, we can tell the biological age of a patient based on where their heart lights up, as opposed to their chronological age. So in this way, we're able to provide insight into accelerated biological aging, or people that are biologically young, even though they're 90 years old. And so if you think about that, that's kind of the future, I think, where you have all this data, like you were talking about, Abel, and yet we don't know half of it means. Well, these computers can see things we can't, and then we can use our biological understanding and knowledge and application and say, oh, we can use this as a way to figure out how old someone is from a biological perspective. So those are some of the ways in which we're using the tools that we're developing.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, especially the aging part. So according to that logic, though, Sanjeev, you're biologically an 80-year-old pickleball player. It sounds like so.
I'm older than that. I'm 90, I think.
You're 90, so that's the
Pickleball,
downside of what
yeah.
you just described. Now, some of the it's not all like obviously apple pie. Kelly, you've been thinking a lot about this. So what are some of the concerns that this type of new technology might raise when you apply it to healthcare? So what kind of things does this raise in your mind?
Yeah. Well, I was going to add, actually, before I answer that, we see this, we're seeing it in the PICU too. There's two questions that I get asked when children get admitted to my intensive care unit. Most commonly, one is, how long am I going to be here? And the other is my child going to survive? Maybe in the reverse order. But we're now able, one of the reasons that people come into the intensive care unit is they have low blood pressure. We're now able to use characteristics of patients to determine blood pressure over time, so to predict how things happen. So we're seeing this we're seeing it all over medicine. I think one concern that many have, and actually I think it might have come up in a question, is really about how do we account for issues that come into the data in terms of biases. Someone, I think in the question, asked about social determinants of health. And I think that that's a huge challenge that we need to kind of face head on with all of this work. When I've been thinking about this, I think about sort of a couple of sort of big categories of spaces where we need to be very careful about the data, what it means, and how we use it. One is, where does the data come from? And are there any inherent biases in the data that we need to think very carefully about, so that the outcomes that Sanjeev and Lee are talking about, they're really reflective of what's actually happening. The other place is sort of the processing. How are we making decisions about what goes into the process? And included in that, can we make any decisions about things like good and bad? I talked at the beginning about the fact that what was really important to me is, how do I talk to my patients, individual people? And we don't have clear ways of introducing that sort of human component into some of the decision making at this point. And so how do we think carefully about that? And then the last piece of it for me is, when you get the technology, how does it actually get implemented? And how do I, as a clinician, continue to have that really important personal interaction with my patients while integrating that technology? And I think we're a long way away from the technology being able to do the kinds of things that we as humans can do on the one hand. And on the other hand, we also need the technology to help us with a lot of things. There's new diseases, new medicines, new labs, everything is changing in medicine so quickly that we need technology to help us. And how do we blend that? So those are some of the big challenges that I have been thinking about as we learn more and develop more.
If we take that logic further, I mean, let's say AI does get better. I mean, we've all seen Terminator and Skynet. That's bad, but like in healthcare, what we hear oftentimes is, well, if it gets that much better, is it going to replace us? And so, like, oftentimes you'll hear people say, well, we're not going to need radiologists anymore because AI is going to replace radiologists if it were to keep on progressing. So I don't know, like, Lee, you're in the imaging space. I mean, you probably have heard that before. I mean, how do you respond to that? I mean, are we all going to be out of jobs and we should start, brushing off resumes, or what's next?
Yeah, I think at least for my lifetime, you guys are safe. There was a really famous AI scientist. He's Canadian and probably the most famous guy involved in deep learning. In 2016, he said, in 5 years, radiologists will be a thing of the past. We won't need them anymore. So, here we are, it's 2021, and, we still need the radiologists. So I think, one of the things to keep in mind are the limitations of this technology. So, for example, it can really break down quickly when it's trying to deal with exceptional cases. And so AI really requires, thousands of examples to learn and achieve that, really top tier, high-end diagnostic accuracy. And, for a lot of cases that come up, you're just not going to be able to find that amount of data. Where, very good radiologists can recognize something that's very unusual, and they might even just remember that they read about it once in their book, and they can recognize that. So, that's how humans and machines are very different. And so I see, the machines and the humans coming together as a team, having complementary abilities. And, I think that will really just kind of sort of improve everything all the way around. It'll also help the doctors spend more time on interesting things and not, consume so much of their time with kind of routine cases.
Yeah, so it's not replacing so much, but augmenting or helping, and then hopefully that time is spent better elsewhere. Whether it be talking to patients or some other engagement. That seems like a much better future than being replaced. Clearly. Now, how about like in terms of like near-term wins though? If you guys think in your domains, like where do you see some of the next, let's say 1 to 3 years? Where do you think that we're going to start seeing like some nice improvements, gains that are tangible that patients might be able to see today? So I don't know, Sanjeev, if you have things that are in the hopper that you're thinking about for the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think probably the The one area that's going to affect patients the most, I think, is this earlier diagnosis, automated diagnoses. There may be even direct to consumer type stuff where, you have some data that you have, either you get your images from your doctor and you upload it somewhere, or you have data from your smartphone or watch that goes in and diagnoses disease. For example, there are algorithms from when you are, say your pulse, you have an Apple Watch and your heart rate, heart rhythm is normal. Well, there's algorithms even in a normal rhythm that can predict your risk of having an irregular rhythm like atrial fibrillation in the next year. So that could, alert you, and it may get into the hands of consumers. But I think in a way, we need to grapple with that as clinicians as to what to do with that data, sort of like direct to consumer genetic data. But one way or the other, I think it will be helpful in the future. For healthcare providers, which then I think will help patients in the long run, is increasing our efficiency. So, in terms of being more efficient in reading scans, for example, where the computer's making automated measurements and showing us how they made those measurements so we can correct them if needed, and that goes back into the algorithm to make it better. But also, we call it the ambient clinical environment, basically have AI listening into the patient physician appointment, in clinic, and basically transcribing it, but doing more than transcribing, making sense of the discussion and putting it into a note. I know that many doctors would love for something like that because they can spend more time with the patient. They're not like on their computer fiercely typing away,
Yeah.
and they're actually able to spend time being, a doctor.
Yeah. Kelly, what does that make you think when you hear that?
I love that idea because I spend far too much of my time during the day writing notes, and I wish I could spend more of it talking to patients. So yeah, I agree. I think that in my field, I feel like we're already seeing advances related to prognosis that really helps us talk to families. It helps us think with them about what their path may look like and what kind of decisions they need to make. And I do agree also that it's making clinicians' lives a little bit more, a little bit easier. I think that, the ethicist in me wants to go, okay, it's so scary to imagine that you're recording my conversation with my doctor. And so that's where my ears perk, and I say, we need to do all of this with patients. We need patients helping us in developing this technology and thinking about what's going to be concerning to people, what's not going to be concerning to people. How can we maintain trust in this environment that includes technology? And I think that's crucially important. There's actually data about it, and I think we need more of it. But what I've seen in some of the data is that people are very interested in sharing their information if they know it's secure. And so how can we think with people about making sure they feel comfortable with what we're doing when they come to visit the doctor's office?
Looks like Abel might be frozen. I guess, I'll continue the discussion and just say that, someone in the Q&A asked about what about the data inputs? So that's extremely important. And I think that, it's sort of like garbage in, garbage out. A lot of the data that gets put into these algorithms don't make a lot of sense, or they're missing huge chunks of data like social determinants of health, which could be a good thing or might increase biases. It's not clear. And so that's something that, I think there's a lot of hype around AI and machine learning that, we're going to cure all of medicine, cure everyone in 5 years. There's a lot of nuances that go into it. So it's really unclear. In my own research, depending on what data you put into the model, these machine learning models, you'll get different classifications of disease, and that, and comparing those may be helpful, but it's really unclear. I'll give you another example, which is, say you were trying to differentiate photos of cats and dogs, and all the cats had hearts on the picture. Well, the computer would be easy to do that because it's gonna figure out what hearts look like, not really what cats and dogs look like. And then all of a sudden you go to actually figure out what a cat or a dog is without the hearts, and it's totally confused. Now that may seem like an outlandish example, but that's exactly what happens in medical imaging every day. There's tons of examples, for example, COVID. So there was the study looking at, I think, COVID x-rays, and they figured out a machine learning algorithm could identify COVID really easily. Turned out they had all these tubes and wires hooked up to them because they were really sick. And it just was, identifying sick people, not COVID. And so these are really important things that I think the public doesn't really, we don't really talk about, and they're impediments to actually making progress in the field. And we really need larger data sets, really well curated. We need to look for all these biases. We need to look at when the computer is probably wrong. And probably the biggest thing for the physicians and the audience, or the other healthcare professionals or researchers in the audience, is that when you read machine learning articles or AI articles and they don't do extensive validation, they don't do prospective validation, that should give you pause. And that means that there needs still a lot of work that needs to be done.
I apologize if I dropped off briefly from internet issues. We have a couple minutes before we start with audience questions, but I wanted you guys each to comment a little bit on what does it take from an investment standpoint? What does it take to make it these next few steps? What do we need to make AI ML a reality in healthcare?
Yeah, I think one thing we think about a lot is creating an ecosystem here in this medical center where we can test AI tools in clinical environments in a way that's safe. And so it really takes so much more than just having an algorithm that has a high validation accuracy. You need all of this infrastructure to be able to capture the data, do the computation on the fly, and share it with the pathologists or the radiologists. And so, that's where I see, the next big push being is in creating that ecosystem that will allow us to do that research.
From my end, I think that we have to be considering at every stage of research what the implications are. And that needs to be a multidisciplinary process that needs to involve the scientists, the technicians, the clinicians, the lawyers, the social scientists, and getting all of those people together doesn't just happen. We need help getting those people together. We have to identify them, and we have to find a way to get them in the room together. And it sounds easy, but people are quite busy. And so unless they have a purpose, you just can't do it. But we even need, and probably at the most, we need patients and their families to be a part of these conversations and to really think clearly about what needs to be in place. Sanjeev mentioned, what data sets you test these algorithms on. I want patients and families in the room helping the technicians think about what challenges they haven't even thought about, that we as people deal with every day, but maybe not come to the mind of the families. So of the people who are developing these technologies. So I think this is a very important part. And we're at the precipice. This technology is changing. It's changing fast. And if we don't think about this stuff now, it's going to be too late, and it's going to be too hard to backtrack.
Hold on to that point for a second, Kelly. Sanjeev, if you haven't gone yet, if you want to comment on that, because some of the questions that are in the chat, I think, relate to what you just said, Kelly. Go ahead, Sanjeev.
Yeah, I think that a good analogy may be like a car factory. So it's like right now we have a bunch of smart engineers, but they've never built a car before, and we have a warehouse full of parts, but they're like literally piled into there. It's a 100,000 square foot warehouse with all these parts, and they're not organized. And so, I think we need to, first of all, train healthcare providers on how to actually be the ones that are directing AI. We have some really innovative programs here where really training doctors and other healthcare providers on how AI works, boot camps for AI programming, et cetera, so that they can get familiar with it and work with data scientists. So it's like training the engineers to actually build cars. And then the second thing is organizing all that data, what Lee was talking about, the infrastructure. It sounds kind of boring, but without the infrastructure, without organizing all the data and having these test environments with it to test all these new algorithms, we really can't go anywhere. And so it's really important. And then finally, it's sort of the implementation. So kind of like, okay, we built the car, but how does it function on the road? We need to test it. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that I see with the work we're doing. We've got models that we think are ready to go and implemented, but trying to convince IT departments and hospitals around the country to actually put it in, trying to get doctors to look at these alerts like, hey, your patient might have disease X, and not just X out of it and delete. So trying to figure out the best way of integrating this into clinical practice is hugely important.
We have a bunch of questions that came in. I'm just going to start picking some from the audience. Dr. Brian Eward had a great question. He asked the question, how are you incorporating social determinants of health and disease into your models? In Chicago, one of the strongest determinants of life expectancy is the L-stop, where you live closest to. The example he gave was Fullerton versus Garfield on the red line. So when you hear that, what do you think? How are you guys incorporating these issues? I know, Kelly, you mentioned a little bit about sort of social science. They need to be at the table.
I mean, this is where I'm grateful for people like Sanjeev and Lee and you, Abel, because I'm not the technologist, but really trying to delve into understanding how the models are coming up with the answers that they're coming up with. And Sanjeev, you talked about, if you're trying to differentiate a cat and a dog and all the cats have hearts, what are you really looking at? And I think being very careful about that is probably going to be helpful, and going into the data with our eyes wide open. Someone talked about the garbage in, garbage out problem. We need to see where the data is coming from so that we know if there are inherent biases in the data. If we had data from everyone across the country, across the world, then we might be able to sort through some of this, but we don't yet, and we're a long way from having that. So you need to look at the data sets very carefully, what they represent, where they come from, and how they're getting used in these algorithms.
Yeah, I think it can help, and it might hurt sometime. I mean, for example, in heart failure, we're always looking at new ways to predict who's going to have a bad outcome, who's going to be hospitalized, who's going to die from their heart failure, so we can maybe do a transplant or a mechanical device to help support their heart. And clearly, social determinants of health are really important. And so if we don't incorporate those into our prediction models, it's like we're not seeing half the picture. That said, incorporating race and social determinants of health and things like that can also increase disparities. And that might also be problematic. I give an example of incorporating race into the determination of kidney disease. So the glomerular filtration rate. So for decades or years, at least, we've been saying if they're African-American, they have one glomerular filtration rate or kidney function. And if they're non-African-American, they have another. And people were worried that actually was, increasing disparities because Black patients weren't getting access to dialysis, for example. Now, I saw that in the other perspective that because many of our heart failure clinical trials exclude patients with kidney disease, now all of a sudden, all my Black patients so I could get into the trials, I can't get in anymore because they're biased the other way because they have kidney disease. So, I think what I would say is for social determinants of health and disparities, we need to make that, like Kelly was saying, that needs to be the part of the conversation for every machine learning study. We need to be asking ourselves, are we biased in one way or the other, good or bad, based on some of these? And are we worsening disparities with our machine learning models? Because that would be terrible.
Agreed. Yeah. Lee, any thoughts about that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, this is getting more and more attention in pathology. People have shown that models that predict prognosis for prostate cancer, they don't have equal performance for Black and white men. And, I think the first step is teaching people to examine these issues, certainly before you build the algorithm, but also after you have the algorithm to look at, any kind of disparities in performance.
So I'm going to pick another question that is a slight change, but gets at maybe some of the things that the Institute could get really involved in. Bimal Chowdhury asked, if the future of medicine is one of augmented intelligence, and he thinks it is, how can we meet the medical education needs to the vast majority of clinicians who do not understand these models? So anyone can go for it.
Well, I think that, Abel, I'd love to get your thoughts on this because you're so involved in a lot of training initiatives. But it's like any other new technology in medicine. I mean, at some point, new technologies come up and new methods come up, and we've got to train the clinicians of today, whether it's, real focused, for example, laparoscopic surgery. An internist doesn't really need to know anything about that, but a lot of surgeons had to learn a whole new skill, right? Robotic surgery, things like that. But there are other things that have taken over all of medicine, like how to work with electronic health records. So I think it's just a matter of incorporating it into medical education more routinely. And the sooner we can start doing it, the better. But Abel, you do a lot in this area, so.
Well, I will put a plug in for some of the work recently. The School of Medicine just recently put in place 2 faculty who are going to incorporate artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data science into the medical student curriculum. And so we have dedicated faculty now who are going to embed that. And so one of the first campuses that is actually putting in at that entry level. I'd argue that we also need to do even more, even before people get into medicine. And so I think that the type of candidates that are coming through, we want them to also, it may call for certain newer aptitudes that we haven't even thought about yet. And then in the Institute itself, we've actually been putting in a lot of effort, and this is also gets at sort of what can we invest in to make the field more inclusive. And that is this idea of a data gymnastics academy. We've been talking about that because my daughter's in gymnastics, but like it's mostly a safe place where people can operate with data sets that are based on real world data or real world data that will allow students, trainees, or even industry partners to get involved in some of these collaborations and test out before it gets in front of a patient. Is it really going to work, and is it going to do what it's supposed to do? At the same time, it allows us to bring in trainees that they should be focused on clinical medicine, but it also gives them an exposure to allow them to go ahead and get a really deep practical experience with this. So the Institute is one of those places I think that is a nice convening point for this type of initiative. I mean, others have comments about that before I pick out another question or two. I think that gets at I see some other comments about basic understanding about AI. And again, I think that, I hate to say it, but it's harder to learn as we get through more advanced, but it shouldn't stop us. But again, I think that there's efforts both at the trainee level and also at the more senior level that can help with that. A couple other questions that I'm seeing that might be of interest. Oh yeah, we'll pass. Some of these are nice comments I think people have put in. One question that had come up the other day was, when are these things going to be actually put back in place in direct patient care? For example, in the EMR, like how do we see it? Is it going to cost something? How are patients going to see this in their day-to-day care? So I don't know if you guys have any experience with that or seeing this coming into practice in the very near future.
Well, I think it's tough because a lot of steps need to happen before this comes to patients, or at least I should say a lot of steps need to happen. So here's an example. So first of all, let's say in my own research, we developed a tool to diagnose this cardiac amyloidosis. Okay, great. So in the background, in the electronic health record, this computer algorithm is going to be looking at all the patients with heart failure and alerting their doctor, okay, they might have cardiac amyloid, so you should look into that. Well, okay, that's going to result in, if the algorithm is too broad and it's not specific enough, that's going to result in a lot of testing, maybe a lot of unnecessary testing. And then are more patients diagnosed than with routine clinical practice? We need to do a clinical trial, randomized clinical trial to figure that out. After we've validated prospectively that this thing actually works, then we do the randomized clinical trial, say it does work. But now we're diagnosing a bunch more patients who have the disease, but the treatment costs $225,000 a year. And so are we bankrupting the medical system, and are we actually leading to longer lives? And then say we prove all of that and it's a great thing, and we push it out there to the rest of the medical centers around the country, are they actually even going to use it? And are they just going to be annoyed, like what I was saying before, when a pop-up comes up or they're told that, hey, your patient might have this disease? Are they just going to ignore it? So these are real questions that I think we need to solve. And they require all kinds of disciplines, not just data scientists and AI, but clinical trialists, implementation scientists. And I think that's really the steps that need to be taken for this to actually be useful for healthcare today.
Do you think is there a role for patients in this?
Yeah, well, I think that, and I'd love to hear what others think. I mean, so we are, not necessarily yet in AI, but in clinical trials. So I run a lot of clinical trials, and we typically have a steering committee, and it's a bunch of stuffy doctors and, without any patient input. And now several trials, at least in cardiology, are putting a patient on the steering committee of the trial to help kind of voice the patient's concerns. We have a lot of meetings with the FDA where there are patients on the panel that express, what's the burden on the patient and what does the patient care about in terms of the outcomes and things. And I see no reason why that can't be implemented with AI. I think the other thing is, what I was talking before about the direct to consumer type of, what things could patients really advocate for? They want their data, and they want to be able to use their data and develop insights from the data. I think that's going to be a huge area in the future.
Kelly, thoughts about that?
Even a little bit more. I don't know if you're able to hear me, but if I would go even a little bit farther and say that I don't think we can do any of this without patients and families at the table. I think they need to be at the table for all aspects of this work, so that we have their viewpoints, and they're gonna bring forward ideas that we wouldn't have thought about, and we need that. So I think that's very important. That is, by the way, not an easy thing to do. And going back to social determinants of health, what's even harder than getting patients at the table is getting patients that reflect a wide variety of people in the community, and that takes a lot of effort, but it's crucially important.
What's interesting about this conversation is that we talked about technology, but what we're ending up is actually that we actually need more people involved, whether those be trainees or patients. And so we need more and more diverse people at the table to realize this technology. It's funny, I was at a sort of a retreat last week, put on by the computer science department up in Evanston, and actually was sponsored by Underwriters Laboratory. And there was one really interesting thing, and it was all about artificial intelligence, how we're gonna but in the background of the Underwriters Laboratory, I didn't realize this, but their motto, I wrote it down because I loved it so much. It had a motto written in Latin. It said, "Ignis Servis Non Dominus." And I think it very much applies to this technology. Basically what it translates to is fire as servant, not as master. Given that Underwriters Laboratory was all about safety of technologies, because one of the big risks was fire. Well, we have that same thing. There's this potential great technology, but I think at the end of the day, we have to remember that it's the servant, and at the end of the day, it's subservient to people, which in this case are the master. And so I think this is a good example, and it sounds like through this conversation, it's become clear, same thing. Like, we very much want lots of people involved, and that should include patients, is what I'm hearing, which is great. One last thing that was brought up was a question about regulatory issues. I mean, there's the issue of putting these back into practice, but it's not just about getting patients. I think there's regulatory issues that are being raised as well. I don't know if any of you had experience with passing muster with regulatory, bodies to get this back into practice. I don't know if you've come across that.
This did come up, has come up a lot in cardiology. So, people want to make, what I talked about before, making diagnoses, making measurements earlier and sooner than before. So, and so more automated. And so, one of the basic measurements on an ultrasound of the heart or an echocardiogram is the ejection fraction, what fraction of blood is getting, what percentage of blood is getting pumped out with every heartbeat. And that seems like an easy thing, but it's a very important measurement. And, it'd be nice if it could be automated. Well, the FDA has to approve that. It has to approve that the algorithm actually works, because this is actually going to be used by clinicians to make diagnoses, to target treatments and things, to select treatments. So that's one regulatory that it's almost like getting a new device approval. You have to be able to prove that it's real. And I think more and more the FDA is not going to be totally satisfied with a completely black box. Hey, the machine algorithm works, but we don't know, machine learning, we don't know why. I think that we're going to need to do more to show what it's actually using to make that diagnosis. And that goes, so I think for medical imaging, that's going to be really, really important in getting regulatory approval.
Yeah, I think they're still trying to figure out ways to deal with this. It's kind of a gray area. And I think one of the more promising areas of algorithms that are continuously learning and improving is something that's very hard for them to handle, because they like to think about things being locked down and frozen. But that's where I think a lot of the promise is in these continuously improving systems.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is going to fundamentally shift how the FDA has to look at devices, for exactly the reason that you just said, Lee. The algorithm they approve today is going to change tomorrow because of the new patients that this algorithm sees. And so striking that balance can be a huge challenge for the FDA.
That's great.
Yeah, I wonder, just one thing real quick. I wonder how Tesla deals with this, because they're constantly updating their operating system in their car. And every time that happens, do they actually have to get approval from the government agency or something, or do they just kind of update their systems? I mean, so that might be a model of how, does the NTSB have to approve the Transportation Safety Board that it's going to be safe, or do they just update it continuously without any approval? I don't know.
Well, I think that's a nice place to end on. That Elon Musk is going to determine our future in healthcare too. But first of all, I just want to take some time to thank, first of all, Dave and the organizers for making this possible. I want to thank the audience for sending in great questions both before and during the session. And special thanks to Dr. Coopers, Michelson, and Dr. Shah. You guys are doing amazing work. It's a joy to work with you, and really excited to see where you take these next couple of years. And I think we're all in good hands. And I think David, wanted the last 2 minutes, for a word from David.
Abel, let me echo your appreciation for everybody for the informative discussion, as well as the work that you and your colleagues at iAIM do to advance healthcare. It's incredibly exciting. And thanks to all of you, our guests who joined us this afternoon. Your interest in this area speaks volumes about you, and that's very significant, I think. We'll be sending all of our registrants an email which contains links to this discussion, so you can re-listen or send it on to someone else, as well as a link to the iAIM website. My email also will be included, so if you have questions which were not answered, please email them to me and I will route them to the appropriate person. And finally, philanthropic support, I have to say, is vital if we're to advance the work of iAIM and all these issues that you heard talked about today, and so many more that we didn't have a chance to discuss. So please email me if you'd be interested in having a conversation about the possibility of you providing financial support for these amazing people's efforts and work. So thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.